The rain fell as though the sky itself was grieving with me. Cold, heavy drops blurred the view of the headstone in front of me, though my vision was already clouded by tears. My hands trembled as I clutched the folded program of my son's funeral, his picture smiling back at me, a smile I would never see in this world again. He was only 9 years of laughter, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and endless I love yous. 9 years of dreams I had cradled in my heart for him, now shattered into pieces too sharp to touch without bleeding. The pain of burying your child is unlike anything words can capture. It's not just grief, it's an open wound in the soul, a wound that never closes, only deepens with each breath. The pews were filled with neighbors, friends, and even kind strangers who had heard of my loss. People came forward to hug me, to whisper condolences, to place flowers near his small coffin. Yet as I glanced around, searching desperately for the two faces I had prayed would be there, I found only emptiness. My parents, they weren't there, and neither was my sister. At first, I thought maybe they had been delayed, maybe traffic had trapped them. Maybe the rain had slowed their journey. Every car door that opened outside, every late arrival, I turned my head in hope, but hope soon curdled into disbelief. Then disbelief hardened into a cruel, cutting realization. They had chosen not to come. I remember clutching my son's favorite toy rug, the one he had carried everywhere, even to bed. My knuckles went white as the truth sank deeper. My parents and his grandparents had decided that celebrating my sister's upcoming wedding was more important than mourning their grandson. That night, after the funeral, my phone buzzed with a single message from my mother. I stared at the screen, my chest heaving, praying it would contain an apology, a reason, any shred of humanity. Instead, it read, "I hope you understand, sweetheart. The wedding is in a few weeks, and there's just so much to plan. We didn't want to bring sadness into it. You know how important this is for your sister." I dropped the phone, my tears turning hot with rage. Important? What could possibly be more important than saying goodbye to a child, to blood of their blood? I curled up on the floor of my darkened living room, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. The grief inside me shifted that night. It began to take on another shape, sharper and heavier. Betrayal. They hadn't just abandoned me, they had abandoned him. My son, their grandson, who used to run into their arms every Sunday. My son, who once proudly drew Grandma and Grandpa in his crayon sketches. My son, who had begged for them to come see his school play just a year ago. And when he left this world, they weren't there. That night, as I sat alone with my broken heart, one thing crystallized inside me. I was utterly on my own now. Whatever ties of loyalty or family I thought existed had died with my son. But I didn't yet know that the deepest betrayal was still to come. The weeks after the funeral passed in a haze. I barely remember how I got out of bed most mornings, or how I managed to put food on the table for myself. Every corner of the house whispered of my son and the half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, the little sneakers by the door, the faint scent of his shampoo lingering in the bathroom. Grief is strange. It's not just sadness. It's the weight of silence pressing down on you until you can't breathe. It's the sharp stab in your chest when you wake up and, for a split second, think maybe it was all a nightmare until reality crushes you all over again. During those weeks, my parents didn't call, not once. No flowers, no visits, no messages to ask how I was surviving. The same people who had raised me, who were supposed to be my anchor in storms, had vanished completely, until one Saturday afternoon, when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find them standing there. My mother's hair was pinned neatly, her lips painted in a perfect shade of pink, and my father's suit looked as if they had come straight from an upscale dinner. They looked polished, radiant even. Nothing about them reflected mourning. Nothing about them mirrored my hollow eyes or the emptiness that lived in me now. I wanted to slam the door in their faces, but a desperate part of me still hoped for an apology, an explanation, anything that would tell me they cared. So, I stepped aside and let them in. "Sweetheart," my mother said as she brushed past me, her perfume thick and sweet, almost suffocating. "We know it's been a broken bar, a difficult time." Difficult. That word sliced through me like a blade. Losing your child isn't difficult. Misplacing your keys is difficult. Deciding what to eat for dinner is difficult. Burying your son is devastation. But I stayed quiet. My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. We sat in the living room. My father cleared his throat. A rehearsed sort of sound. He leaned forward, his hands folded. "There's something we need to discuss," he said. I braced myself. Maybe it was about finally honoring my son in some way. Maybe they wanted to help me preserve his memory. Maybe, just maybe, they were here to mend the wound they'd torn open. But my mother's next words destroyed whatever scraps of hope I had left. "It's about the trust fund, the one you set aside for him, the $850,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. My son's trust, the fund I had worked myself raw to build over the years, scraping every dollar, working late shifts, saving bonuses. I had started it the day he was born, his safety net, his future, my way of making sure he'd never struggle the way I had." I swallowed hard. "What about it?" My mother smiled gently, as though she were discussing something trivial. "Well, with him gone, he doesn't need it anymore, but your sister does. Her wedding is in 3 months. And she wants it to be memorable, a once-in-a-lifetime event. Think of how beautiful it could be with that money. Your son would want his family to be happy, don't you think?" I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. My ears buzzed, my chest burned, and my hands trembled. "Broken bar, you're asking me to give my dead son's trust to fund a wedding?" My father sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Don't be dramatic. He's gone. The money won't bring him back, but it can serve a purpose for someone still here. Your sister deserves this happiness. You can't begrudge her that." I laughed in a bitter, hollow sound that startled even me. "You skipped his funeral. You didn't cry. You didn't even show up. And now you come here, smiling, dressed like you're on your way to a gala, to tell me his life's savings should go to a wedding?" My mother's expression hardened. The gentle act melted away, revealing steel underneath. "Don't make this difficult. You have always had a tendency to hold on to things. Let this go. Give your sister the trust. We're family." Family. That word no longer felt sacred. It felt like a weapon, sharpened and used to cut me open. I sat there, silent, the storm inside me louder than thunder. On the outside, I looked calm and nodding, pretending to listen, even as my parents laid out their plans. But inside, something shifted permanently. I realized, in that moment, that my parents hadn't just abandoned me. They hadn't just skipped my son's funeral. They were trying to erase him completely, to rewrite his existence into a line item for a party. And though I didn't say it aloud, I made a vow right then. They would never touch that trust. They would never tarnish his memory with their greed. Not now. Not ever. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' faces as calm, composed, untouched by grief as they asked me to hand over my son's trust. Their voices echoed in my head, replaying like a broken record. "He doesn't need it anymore. Your sister deserves happiness. Don't make this difficult." Each phrase scraped at my insides, peeling away layer after layer of restraint until only raw fury remained. I sat in my son's room, surrounded by his things. His tiny desk with crayons scattered across it, the shelf where his favorite books leaned against one another, the blankets still rumpled on his bed. His world remained frozen in time, untouched since the day he left. And now, the people who should have cherished him most wanted to strip even his legacy away. I thought back to all the years I had sacrificed to build the trust fund. I remembered working 2 jobs when he was still in diapers, slipping quietly out of the apartment before sunrise and returning long after he had fallen asleep. I remembered my aching feet, the cold dinners eaten alone, the endless nights where exhaustion clawed at my bones, but I never once complained, because every dollar I tucked away was a promise to him. It wasn't just money, it was my vow that he'd have opportunities I never had: college, a safe home, a secure life. That trust was his future, carved from my sweat and my love. And now, my parents, who had never once contributed, who had always looked at me as though I were the lesser daughter, the burden, the afterthought, had dared to demand it for a party, a wedding. I remembered my sister growing up had a golden child, the favorite. She was the one who always got the bigger slice of cake, the prettier dress, the louder applause. I was the shadow. My achievements, no matter how hard-earned, were brushed aside while hers were celebrated like miracles. When I became a mother, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe they would love my son as fiercely as I did. For a while, it seemed true. Grandma's hugs, grandpa's jokes, Sunday visits. But even that love was shallow, conditional, disposable. Because when the moment came to choosing between their grandson's funeral and floral arrangements for a wedding, they chose the wedding. My hands clenched into fists. For the first time, I felt something sharper than grief, rage, but rage without direction burns out quickly. Mine, however, began to crystallize into something else, something colder, steadier. I realized I had a choice. I could beg them for scraps of decency, or I could stop expecting anything at all. They wanted his trust. They thought I'd hand it over quietly. I whispered into the silence of my son's room, my voice trembling but certain. They'll never get it. Not a single cent. Not while I'm alive. A strange calmness washed over me as I spoke those words. It was as though a dam inside me had broken, letting my grief flow into determination. I would protect his memory with the same ferocity I had once used to protect his future. The breaking point wasn't a scream. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a quiet vow whispered in the darkness, a vow that I would never let them erase him. I didn't yet know how, but I would make sure my parents and sister paid for what they'd done. Not with money, but with truth, with shame, with the weight of their own cruelty reflected back at them until they could no longer escape it. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something flicker inside me that wasn't despair. It was the beginning of revenge. Once the fury settled into a slow, burning purpose, I learned to wear patience like armor. Revenge, I discovered, was not always fire and storm. Sometimes it was a quiet, patient thing, a winter that worked in silence until everything else withered. I started with a trust. It had been my life's work. Small, stubborn deposits when I could spare them, bonuses redirected, birthdays where I gave him more than I gave myself. I had opened it with a bank manager I trusted, signed papers with trembling hands the day he was born, and named him as the sole beneficiary. For years the paperwork sat like a promise, dry and legal and distant. Now it felt like a living cord tied to his name, and nothing would sever it without my will. I called a lawyer. His office smelled of coffee and old books. He spoke plainly, the kind of language that anchored you. Clause, trustee, irrevocable, fiduciary duty. He explained what I already suspected and what I needed to do. There were ways to protect a trust without drama. Appoint a neutral trustee, tighten the disbursement conditions, add irrevocable protections so my parents' greedy hands could not reach it. It would cost money, and it would take time. Time, I realized, was a resource I could use. They were in a hurry for a wedding. I was in no hurry to pardon their cruelty. While the lawyer rewrote the papers, I practiced a different performance at home. I let my parents believe they had rattled my cage. I let them come over, prim and persuasive, dripping with faux concern. I smiled in measured doses. I cooked them the same meal I'd made 100 times for family Sundays. I let my mother touch my arm like she always had. That small, rehearsed affection that ignored the absence at the graveside. I listened as they recast their demand in softer terms. Think about it, sweetheart, my father would say, leaning in, his voice syrupy. For the family, or your sister, a bit of money, and life goes on. You're being so dramatic, my mother would add when I didn't immediately agree. We're not asking you to throw it away. We only want to use some of it to think of the memories we could make, the family photos. They thought they had me. They thought my grief had left me naive, malleable. They were wrong. I let them believe the soft lies they preferred. I let them conspire, gave them the illusion of influence. They made plans for the wedding, picked flowers, sampled cakes that would never be purchased with my son's name on them. My mother sent me photos of swatches and venues with hearts next to them. I replied with small, non-committal words, "We'll see. I'll think about it. Maybe." Meanwhile, behind a curtain of diplomacy, I worked the law into armor. The trustee we appointed was a reputable firm, not a relative, with strict disbursement rules. The money could be used for education, health, housing, things that would keep my son's name tethered to life. Not parties. I added a memorial clause that specified the funds would only be directed to organizations or causes that benefited children, or held in reserve for any descendants, should they exist. I made it painfully clear, in legalese and ink, that the trust's purpose was never to fund weddings. I made the provisions so immovable that even if my parents hired armies of lawyers, they could not pry the account open. The day I signed the new paperwork, I felt my body sag with something I hadn't felt since before the funeral. Control. It didn't bring him back. It couldn't, but it closed a door on the version of my family that had attempted to commodify his memory. Protecting the money was only the beginning. Money with simple people were complicated. My parents had pride, status, and a social circle that loved to gossip politely over tea. They cared in a performative way about what people would think, and that, I knew, could be used against them. So I began to gather truth, not the vicious kind people imagine when they think of revenge, not break-ins, not blackmail. I kept everything legal, but I let evidence of their betrayal build like rain in a culvert until it burst. I collected messages, dates, photos, other small things that, when strung together, showed a consistent pattern of preference. Invitations to events they chose over family funerals. Photos of them cheering at my sister's dress rehearsal on the very week of my son's illness. A video my sister had posted, giddy and celebratory, captioned about wedding planning the day the doctors called us in for the final consultation. It stung reliving those moments, seeing them all in black and white, but it was necessary. Each piece of proof was a stitch in a larger tapestry that would, later, cover the faces of those who wronged me. When the trust's protections were ironclad, I implemented the second phase, exposure. But exposure, I knew, needed to be surgical. I wanted shame to land where it belonged, not scatter like ash. I didn't smash their social life out of malice, I let consequence follow action. The first targeted blow was subtle. I began to speak not to them, but to people who mattered in different ways. To friends of the family who might have assumed they were tender, devoted grandparents. I told the truth, quiet as a confession. Face-to-face conversations are strange weapons. You watch the sympathy ripple across another person's features, feel the judgment settle in their eyes, and know the truth is spreading. Did you know they didn't attend the funeral? I'd ask over coffee, voice low. They were too busy with wedding arrangements. People would recoil. Really? They'd say, incredulous. I thought they were so close, a broken bar. I watched the distance grow. Invitations that had once come my way stopped arriving. Not because I wanted them to stop coming, but because I wanted the hollow circle of polite society to reveal itself for what it was. Their friends, many of whom were strangers to the kind of grief I endured, suddenly found it harder to defend absence. I also found courage in small acts of public truth. At the coffee shop where my mother frequently took her friends, I bumped into an old neighbor. The neighbor had loved my son. He brought him comic books and called him Little Man. When I mentioned the funeral and my parents' absence, the woman's face collapsed, then hardened, then softened into anger. That's unforgivable, she said. Later, I learned she stopped hosting my mother for bridge nights. Small ripples became waves. My sister, meanwhile, floated in her own bubble of blissful ignorance. She called, breathless with wedding details, oblivious to the tide turning around our parents. She posted photos of dress fittings and honeymoon ideas, and my mother replied with effusive, proud comments. They lived in that filtered world where every shiny thing was proof of virtue. But the truth is persistent. It ignores filters. One afternoon, a mutual cousin, someone who had always adored drama but also listened, asked to see my son's memorial page. I hesitated, then agreed. I had created it not as a weapon but as a sanctuary. Photos, videos, stories of his laugh, the silly way he insisted on mismatched socks. I sent the link. The cousin wept. Then she wrote a message to my mother and sister that I never meant for the world to read. How could you miss his funeral? He was a child. I don't understand. The message spread. People began to ask awkward questions. At first, it was whispers and raised eyebrows. Then came invitations unaccepted by my parents. Then awkward silences when my mother tried to bring up wedding seating arrangements in the same breath she mentioned my son. The public performance grew harder to maintain. They blamed me. At family gatherings, my mother would choke the words out, "You're making things difficult. You're driving wedges where there were none." My father would sigh, heavy with the burden of being misunderstood. They made themselves martyrs, while expecting me to be the villain for wanting to protect what was mine. I would listen, arms folded, and let them believe their narrative. Meanwhile, bridesmaids' dresses were ordered against an invisible clock, and my sister's world gleamed like something cut out of a magazine. Yet, as their social law changed, A chill crept through their community, a sense that they had prioritized show over substance. The neighborhood that once applauded them now watched with a private, uncomfortable silence. I never crashed the wedding planning. I never publicly humiliated them in a way that would feel cheap. Instead, I built a counter-narrative as quietly as I had built the trust, one that focused on memory and meaning. I organized a small memorial fundraiser in my son's name, ostensibly to support the children's ward at the hospital where he had been treated. I invited neighbors, teachers, and people who had touched his life. I made sure to include stories, not caricatures of sorrow, but vivid recollections. The sound of his laugh, the way he would rescue caterpillars and set them on safe leaves, the way he stacked blocks until they tumbled in a triumphant crash. People came. They cried. They gave. They remembered. The fundraiser raised money, yes, but it did something else. It reminded the community of what matters. It gave faces to the grief my parents had sidestepped. It placed my son not as a footnote behind a wedding gown but as the center of unvarnished love. Word of the fundraiser spread. Invitations to the wedding were rescinded by some who felt it would be wrong to celebrate when the family had shown such callousness. The caterer's assistant confided to my friend that certain suppliers were whispering about reputational risk. My sister, who had assumed a smooth, dazzling runway to her big day, began to feel the first pricks of consequence. And then the most exquisite piece of the plan, calmly planned today. I mailed an elegant, understated packet to the wedding planner she had hired. It contained a copy of the trust's new provisions, the irrevocable clause, the trustee's name, and a polite note. The trust is irrevocable and designated for causes benefiting children. It cannot be used for weddings. I would appreciate it if you could advise the family accordingly. The note wasn't vitriol, it was fact. It was a reminder. I imagined my sister reading it with the same bright, disbelieving smile she wore in photos. I imagined the planner's eyes darkening, the cassocks of arrangement fittingly collapsing. I imagined the first whispered phone call from a bridesmaid who'd read the clause and felt suddenly uneasy about attending a party that had been bankrolled, the planner's thought, by the wrong hands. Revenge, done slowly and cleanly, as a way of honoring the injured party more than it punishes the offender. I wanted them to feel the cost of their choice, not out of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but so the moral ledger might balance. Just a little. They had made a choice: the community, the firm commitments of trustees and donors, and the memorial I'd built would reflect the consequences. The wedding day came like a sun that had no right to be right. My parents dressed in their finery. My sister was a vision, luminous and bewildered, expecting everyone she loved to be there. Invitations had shortened. The guest list had thinned. A few vendors had been swapped at the last minute. Small, polite distances were kept by people who had realized something they didn't want to voice at the altar. At the ceremony, my sister's smile trembled once or twice. My mother watched her with eyes that were practiced and tight. My father's jaw worked as he tried to maintain composure. I wasn't there. I did not attend. I had no interest in giving them the stage to pretend everything was right. But the reverberations reached them. A cousin who'd once insisted the wedding was the only sensible response to grief stood up from her front row seat and, with a hush of attendance, began to speak to someone on her phone. A message was read aloud by a bridesmaid, a quotation from my memorial page, a tender line about the small, incandescent life that had been lost. Heads turned. Someone handed my mother a folded note. She read it, slowly. The look on her face that day is something I will not forget. It was not the look of a woman who had been shamed by strangers. It was the look of someone who realized the story she had been telling herself, that appearances could replace affection, had been exposed. After the ceremony, whispers spread through the reception like a slow, inevitable tide. My sister's friends asked questions. Vendors muttered about how supplies had been cancelled by callers who refused to be complicit in a celebration funded by a child's legacy. My mother retreated into a small, private anger, trying to control the narrative, denouncing the rumors in clipped sentences to anyone who would listen. My father blamed me, loudly and at length, for making a spectacle. I sat in my son's room that night, not watching their downfall with glee, but listening to the distance in their voices when they called, as if through a pane of glass. They were angry, they were hurt, they were embarrassed. None of those things relieved the pain inside me, but each was a confirmation, The world had finally seen what I had seen when they didn't come to the funeral. They had chosen pageantry over a child's life. Revenge, I learned, is sometimes the quiet assertion of truth. I had protected my son's name, preserved his future as I had promised, and given the community a choice: to celebrate life in a way that honored memory, or to continue pretending that all was well. The choices my parents made had consequences that extended beyond their garden parties and wedding toasts. As the dust settled, people reached out to me in fits and say apologies thin and late, or sometimes offered in the form of awkward condolences for the misunderstanding. My mother sent a letter full of sentences that tried to sound tender. "We are sorry for your pain. We didn't mean to hurt you." But I had learned to listen to actions more than words. Actions had told me who they were. I walked to my son's grave that evening, the path soft with shadow. I carried nothing but a small stone I'd found on our first picnic together, smoothed by a river he once insisted on exploring. I placed it on his plot and spoke aloud the things I'd never said in the months before: that I had kept my promise, that his name would live where it mattered, and that I had not used my son's life as a weapon. I had used it as a shield. I did not know if my parents would ever feel true remorse. I did not know if my sister would one day look back with regret. What I knew was the vital, stubborn fact that the trust remained intact, that his name would be tied to kindness and help for other children, that I had turned my grief into a force that protected, not consumed. Sweet revenge, I realized, was less about spectacle and more about honoring. It was the slow work of righting wrongs, one deliberate act at a time. It was refusing to allow my son's memory to be trafficked in bouquets and confetti. It was choosing, fiercely, to keep his legacy luminous and unpurchased. And in that choice, in that stubborn refusal to let them own him after they'd refused to stand by him, I began, in the middle of my grief, to find the faintest outline of peace. The weeks after the wedding were strangely quiet. For the first time in months, the phone didn't ring with my parents' demands or my sister's chatter about flowers and gowns. Silence had replaced their voices, but it wasn't the same suffocating silence that haunted me after my son's funeral. This silence felt a broken bar lighter. News of the wedding had spread, of course, but not in the glossy, triumphant way my mother had envisioned. The whispers lingered. People had noticed the missing faces in the pews, the awkward tension in the air, the subtle way vendors had withdrawn support. My parents pretended it had been a perfect event, but their smiles never reached their eyes in the photos I later saw online. For once, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like the one holding the truth. One afternoon, I received a letter from my father. His handwriting was neat, steady, as the same script he had used when helping me with homework as a child, but the words on the page were cold. "You've humiliated this family. You've made us pariahs. All for what? To protect money that will rot in a bank account? You've lost us. And you'll regret it when you're alone." I read the letter once, twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in a drawer. A year ago, his words would have broken me. They would have left me sobbing, begging for reconciliation. But now they felt hollow. They had already lost me the day they chose a wedding over a funeral. Instead of answering, I threw myself into building my son's legacy. With the trust fund secure, I worked with a bank's trustee to set up a small foundation in his name. The foundation wasn't grand, but it was really a fund that provided scholarships to underprivileged kids in his school district, supplies for classrooms, and occasional grants for children's hospitals. Every time I signed the paperwork or wrote a check from his memorial fund, I felt like I was tucking him into bed all over again.